Welcome to the channel, where forgotten voices rise again, and the past breathes through powerful storytelling. Today, we begin one of the most dramatic, emotional, violent, and inspirational journeys in human history. The Mexican Revolution, a 10-year storm of courage, betrayal, hope, blood, and transformation that changed an entire continent and reshaped the identity of millions forever. In the next chapters, you will witness a nation rising against oppression, peasants fighting for dignity, leaders dreaming of justice, indigenous communities protecting land, workers challenging injustice, women rewriting gender identity, and heroes like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata standing tall against impossible odds. You will see Mexico before the revolution, crushed under inequality and dictatorship, and then watch how the revolution exploded into war, reshaped culture, created new politics, birthed feminist movements, influenced art, music, religion, education, identity, migration, democracy, and even modern digital activism. This history will take you through blood-soaked battlefields, passionate speeches, secret meetings, and heartbreaking betrayals. You will learn how the revolution shaped modern Mexico, how indigenous pride survived colonial pressure, how peasants reclaimed land, how workers won rights, how democracy grew from sacrifice, how women became warriors and leaders, and how the ideas of Zapata still influence the world today. By the end of this journey, you will not simply know Mexican history, you will feel it. So sit back, open your mind, and get ready to travel across 110+ years of political struggle, cultural rebirth, national identity, and revolutionary fire. Welcome to a story of courage. Welcome to a story of transformation. Welcome to the Mexican Revolution. This is the channel where history becomes alive. The Mexican Revolution did not erupt suddenly in 1910. Rather, it grew from deep historical roots stretching far into the 19th century and even earlier. To understand how a country as complex and culturally rich as Mexico reached a breaking point, we must first explore the social, political, and economic pressures that built layer upon layer across decades. Mexico had gained independence from Spain in 1821, but independence did not provide stability. Instead, Mexico entered a long era of internal power struggles, regional rivalries, and ideological conflicts over what type of nation it should be. Conservatives, liberals, military leaders, wealthy landowners, and the church all competed for influence. Throughout the 19th century, Mexico faced invasions, civil wars, and shifting constitutions. These problems weakened national unity and left large segments of the population disillusioned. By the late 1800s, one man rose and promised order: General Porfirio Díaz. Díaz seized power in 1876 and remained president, effectively dictator, until 1911. His regime, known as the Porfiriato, shaped the environment that sparked the revolution. Díaz modernized Mexico rapidly, attracting foreign investment from the United States and European nations. Railroads expanded across the country, mines opened, telegraph lines were installed, and cities grew more connected to global markets. On the surface, this appeared to be progress, but beneath that surface lay exploitation. Foreign corporations gained control of natural resources, urban elites grew wealthy, and industries thrived at the cost of ordinary Mexican workers, indigenous groups, and peasants. Land, one of Mexico's most sacred and symbolic elements, became concentrated in the hands of a very small elite class. Most rural Mexicans lived in poverty, trapped in debt peonage. Many worked on vast haciendas, belonging to landowners who controlled thousands of acres. Indigenous communities who had once held communal land rights watched their villages dismantled and territory privatized under Diaz's land laws. The Mexican countryside became a place of hunger, humiliation, and rising anger. Meanwhile, Diaz presented Mexico as a stable and modern nation to the world, hosting celebrations for the official centennial of Mexican independence in 1910. However, behind the celebration stood a nation ready to burst with frustration. Workers demanded fair wages, farmers demanded land, intellectuals demanded political freedom, and regional leaders wanted representation. All these forces converged by 1910 when Diaz, aging and believing himself unbeatable, allowed free election talk to circulate. When an idealistic elite reformer named Francisco Madero challenged him, Diaz reacted harshly, arresting Madero and falsifying election results. This betrayal awakened the spirit of rebellion. What began as a political movement quickly expanded into a broad social revolution. By late 1910, peasants, workers, and regional warlords took up arms across Mexico. The spark had been lit. A civil war began that would reshape Mexican identity, challenge centuries of inequality, and produce radical new political and social visions. The nation moved toward chaos, yet also toward transformation. Francisco Madero is often described as the man who opened the door to the Mexican Revolution, even though he did not fully control the outcome of what he unleashed. Madero was born into one of the wealthiest families in northern Mexico, a background far removed from the life of a peasant or worker. However, unlike many elites of his era, he believed deeply in democratic principles and political liberty. He was influenced by spiritualism, liberal philosophy, and European political ideas. Madero refused to implement radical land reform because he wanted stability and feared chaos. Zapata felt betrayed and issued the Plan of Ayala, accusing Madero of abandoning the peasants. In the north, Villa remained loyal longer, but frustration also grew. Workers demanded rights, peasants demanded land, and intellectuals demanded new systems, not merely elections. The United States government, nervous about instability near its border, watched closely. This early stage reveals a crucial truth. The Mexican Revolution was never one single movement. It was a storm made of many winds. Political liberals, rural peasants, indigenous communities, anarchists, regional warlords, feminists, students, factory workers, and soldiers, all fighting for different visions. The revolution began with hope, celebrated Madero as a symbol of change, and then quickly shattered that unity as competing demands collided. The dream of democracy would prove fragile in a land stained with profound social inequality. Violence soon replaced political optimism. By 1912, opposition forces gathered against Madero from multiple directions. Conservative Porfirian elites, angry over losing privilege, plotted restoration of the old order. Radical revolutionaries, furious over delays, demanded faster reforms. Madero attempted to balance diplomacy with firmness, but he lacked military experience, and he trusted men who would later betray him. While Madero desired peaceful reform, Mexico was entering a stage where compromise meant weakness and power belonged to those who commanded troops. Counter-revolutionary generals Felix Diaz and Bernardo Reyes challenged Madero militarily. Another general, Victoriano Huerta, pretended loyalty while waiting for the right moment to seize control. In February 1913, a violent coup known as the 10 Tragic Days erupted in Mexico City. Cannons thundered, civilians died in the streets, and Mexico's capital became a battlefield. Huerta, working with Diaz supporters and backed by the U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, captured Madero. The betrayal shocked the nation. A president elected by the people was overthrown not through fair political process, but through bloodshed and conspiracy. Soon after, Madero and his vice president were assassinated. Their deaths turned Madero into a martyr of democracy and intensified revolutionary fury. The fall of Madero shattered any illusion that simple reform could satisfy the Mexican people. The country exploded into a broader civil war, now motivated by revenge, ideology, and the urgency of social transformation. Zapata in the South continued fighting for agrarian justice under his banner, Land and Liberty. His movement became a symbol of rural resistance and indigenous dignity. In the North, Villa built the División del Norte, an army of astonishing mobility and spirit. Villa was charismatic, unpredictable, and brilliant at guerrilla warfare. He used trains to move troops rapidly, controlled northern territory, and famously paid his soldiers' wages. Huerta attempted to establish a military dictatorship, restoring Porfirian hierarchy and suppressing revolutionary demands. However, Huerta underestimated the united anger he provoked. Venustiano Carranza, a northern political leader, launched the constitutionalist movement against him. Villa and Zapata also opposed Huerta, although they did not support Carranza's long-term political vision. Once again, Mexico's revolution splintered into factions, each carrying unique aims. Despite division, Huerta's rule was doomed. The United States, now under President Woodrow Wilson, withdrew support and pressured Huerta diplomatically. By 1914, Huerta resigned and fled the country. Mexico was liberated from dictatorship again, yet unity did not follow victory. Instead, rival revolutionary armies prepared to fight each other over the future of the nation. When he looked at Mexico under Díaz, he saw a nation outwardly modern but inwardly enslaved to authoritarianism. In 1908, Díaz told an American interviewer that Mexico was ready for democracy and he would not run again for president. Madero took this statement seriously and wrote a book, The Presidential Succession of 1910, calling for free elections. Madero created the Anti-Reelectionist Party, arguing that Mexico had suffered because one man had monopolized power for more than 3 decades. His movement attracted middle-class supporters, small landowners, students, intellectuals, and even some workers. Díaz grew alarmed when Madero gained momentum. Before the election, Díaz ordered Madero's arrest and then declared himself the winner through obvious fraud. Instead of giving up, Madero escaped prison and fled to the United States. On November 20th, 1910, he issued the plan of San Luis Potosí, calling Mexicans to revolt. This document became one of the most important revolutionary triggers in Mexican history. It promised that Díaz would be overthrown, political freedom restored, and stolen land returned to peasants. These promises resonated deeply, especially in central and southern Mexico. Soon after Madero's call, local revolutionary leaders rose. Among the most influential was Emiliano Zapata in the state of Morelos. Zapata was not inspired by liberal democratic theory. His demands were local, immediate, and passionate. Land for those who worked it. In northern Mexico, Pancho Villa emerged as a charismatic leader who commanded cavalry units and built fierce loyalty among miners, cowboys, and ranch workers. Both Villa and Zapata saw themselves as protectors of the poor, even though their backgrounds and regional ideals differed. Madero returned to Mexico in triumph after Díaz fled into European exile in 1911. Crowds welcomed him as a hero, believing a new era of justice had arrived. But very soon, the revolution fractured. That conflict, beginning in 1914, would become one of the most chaotic and decisive phases of the Mexican Revolution, shaping legends like Villa and Zapata, while carving new political identities into Mexico's landscape. The revolution, already stained by betrayal and sacrifice, moved toward its most explosive years in which Mexico would redefine what freedom, justice, and national identity truly meant. After the fall of Victoriano Huerta in 1914, Mexico entered a new stage that was far more complicated than the earlier fight against dictatorship. It became clear that defeating an enemy did not mean establishing unity. Mexico had several revolutionary factions, each holding different values, visions, and strategies. Although the constitutionalist movement under Venustiano Carranza had played a crucial role in defeating Huerta, Carranza's interests did not mirror those of revolutionary leaders such as Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. Instead, Carranza envisioned a centralized national government, primarily led by urban middle-class reformers. Zapata, by contrast, focused on land redistribution and indigenous community autonomy, while Villa wanted federalist independence and strong regional leadership in the North. This ideological diversity explains why the Mexican Revolution split into rival armies even after the dictator's removal. Groups that had worked together against Huerta now saw each other as obstacles to their own political dreams. Villa commanded the División del Norte, the largest and most respected revolutionary army in northern Mexico. His prestige grew from his military success, fierce charisma, and personal ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. Zapata, meanwhile, remained the voice of rural peasants, whose lives had been shaped by generations of land loss and exploitation. He carried a moral authority unmatched by any other leader because he did not seek power for himself. He fought solely to restore justice to peasants. Carranza recognized Villa and Zapata as threats to his leadership. He feared that if either of them controlled the national government, Mexico would break apart into regional fiefdoms. His constitutionalist forces, led militarily by Álvaro Obregón, prepared for confrontation. A national political convention was called in Aguascalientes in 1914 to negotiate who should rule Mexico. Zapata and Villa entered the meeting with widespread support among lower-class populations. The convention elected a neutral candidate, Eulalio Gutierrez, rather than Carranza. This enraged Carranza, who refused to recognize the decision and withdrew to Veracruz to rebuild his strength. Villa and Zapata entered Mexico City triumphantly, a moment that symbolized the peak of their cooperation. Many Mexicans saw these two leaders as liberators who represented genuine people's power. However, neither Villa nor Zapata had interest in administrative bureaucracy, and both lacked the desire to govern from the presidential palace. They never trusted political institutions, believing such institutions had always served elite interests. Their alliance was based on mutual respect rather than strategic planning. They admired each other, yet knew their regional goals were incompatible. Although the fall of Mexico City symbolized revolutionary justice, military occupation did not solve Mexico's problems. The economy was devastated, railroad lines were destroyed, industries interrupted, fields burned, and thousands of civilians displaced. Food shortages produced hunger riots. Inflation made basic necessities unaffordable. Haciendas abandoned by landowners lacked credit and infrastructure to restart agriculture. Diseases spread through rural communities. Many villages relied entirely on revolutionary armies for security and survival. Meanwhile, Carranza and Obregón strengthened their constitutionalist army. They had superior access to northern ports and foreign weapon supply lines, especially from the United States. President Woodrow Wilson, though suspicious of Villa, disliked European powers more. The U.S. government wanted stability and saw Carranza as the most predictable candidate for Mexico's future. These international alliances turned the advantage toward Carranza, setting the stage for one of the most intense civil conflicts of the revolution. The Mexican Revolution of 1914 to 1915 is often remembered as a battle of personalities, but it was far more than that. It was a struggle between social classes, worldviews, and competing ideas of nationhood. To many Mexicans living in rural villages, Zapata symbolized land, justice, and indigenous dignity. He drafted the plan of Ayala years earlier, declaring that land seized by hacienda owners must be returned to campesino families. His supporters did not merely want reform. They desired cultural rebirth. They believed that the Mexican nation belonged to those who worked the soil, not those who signed banking papers or lived in European-style mansions in Mexico City. Zapata organized communal farming experiments, known as ejidos, in the state of Morelos. Workers harvested sugarcane and corn on lands that had once belonged to wealthy hacendados. Under Zapata, common people felt genuine dignity for the first time. They chose local leaders, distributed produce, and defended their communities with armed militias. Zapata's soldiers were disciplined and lived close to the villages they protected, unlike the federal armies who had historically abused rural populations. Villa's world, many miles to the north, reflected a different revolutionary identity. His División del Norte included miners, railroad workers, cowboys, and dispossessed laborers attracted by Villa's charisma and his promise of social mobility. Villa paid his troops wages and rewarded bravery and loyalty. He also controlled strategic territories rich in natural resources and transportation networks. Some historians describe Villa as a Robin Hood figure, a man who stole from the wealthy and distributed to the poor. But Villa was also unpredictable, emotional, and sometimes brutal. His decisions were guided not by ideological doctrine, but by instinct, revenge, and loyalty to his troops. Carranza, however, was a political intellectual. He believed Mexico required constitutional reform, not complete restructuring of its social order. He feared that land redistribution would destroy agricultural productivity and believed regional independence would fragment the country. Carranza wanted a strong presidency, centralized authority, and legal equity, not revolutionary chaos. Urban middle-class professionals, journalists, teachers, and bureaucrats supported him. They valued education, secular reforms, industrial modernization, and national unity. Conflict became inevitable. Zapata and Villa marched toward Mexico City in 1914, believing moral victory would force Carranza into submission. Villa entered the National Palace with applause, sitting in Díaz's old presidential chair for symbolic photographs. Zapata sat politely beside him, refusing to touch the seat because he viewed political power as corrupt. Many Mexicans remember this moment as the symbolic height of peasant political influence. Yet the moment also exposed weakness. Neither leader took formal power. No land reform policy was implemented nationwide, and political vacuum deepened. Meanwhile, Carranza reorganized forces at Veracruz, supported by Obregón, a brilliant strategist who introduced modern military tactics to revolutionary warfare. Obregón studied trench warfare, machine gun defense, and logistical planning, techniques inspired by World War I. Villa's cavalry charges, once unstoppable, became vulnerable against soldiers equipped with barbed wire, automatic weapons, and defensive trenches. By early 1915, Villa's army suffered devastating defeats during the Battle of Celaya and subsequent engagements. Zapata, isolated in the south, lacked resources to influence the national struggle. Carranza regained control of Mexico City and gradually established more formal government institutions. The revolution had entered a new ideological phase, one in which the battlefield determined constitutional destiny. The rivalry between Villa, Zapata, and Carranza not only reshaped Mexico politically, but also transformed Mexican society. The years 1914 to 1915 brought widespread cultural change. Traditional gender roles shifted as women entered revolutionary life as soldiers, nurses, spies, and political thinkers, known as soldaderas or adelitas. These women marched, cooked, fought, transported ammunition, and even commanded troops. Their presence offered new visions of womanhood in Mexican culture, challenging centuries-old patriarchal structures. Newspapers and writers documented revolutionary struggles with remarkable passion. Journalism became a battlefield of ideas. Intellectuals debated nationalism, education, indigenous identity, and the meaning of freedom. Many artists joined revolutionary armies, sketching or photographing everyday life in trenches and villages. These artistic records later shaped Mexican national memory. Economically, the revolution devastated national structures. Railroad networks collapsed, mines shut down, and food scarcity plagued rural and urban people alike. Inflation destroyed savings. Ranching communities lost livestock, leaving thousands unemployed. Peasants who once survived through seasonal labor now found themselves refugees from burned villages. Still, hope remained strong because revolutionary armies promised change that seemed impossible under the Porfiriato. During these years, the United States continued influencing events. President Wilson, who distrusted Villa, gradually withdrew foreign support from him and leaned toward Carranza. Villa's anger toward the United States would eventually lead him to attack Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, provoking a U.S. military expedition into Mexican territory. But in 1914 to 15, these tensions were still developing. The United States hoped Carranza could stabilize Mexico because political chaos threatened American investments in oil fields, railroads, and border trade. Carranza used these advantages to strengthen his rule. He promised constitutional reform, land redistribution programs, although slower than Zapata desired, secular education development, labor rights, and limits on foreign corporate power. His approach appealed to urban workers and teachers who saw opportunity in structured national planning. However, Carranza's path to power came with violence. Peasant villages that resisted his authority faced displacement and repression. Zapata's Morelos region became a constant target for Carrancista attacks. Villa, suffering battlefield defeats, turned to desperate tactics, raiding enemy territories and executing suspected traitors to maintain discipline. The brutality of war hardened revolutionary leaders, shaping the country through fire rather than diplomacy. Still, despite all damage, the Mexican Revolution moved forward intellectually. The nation was learning that reform required law, not only rifles. Carranza soon called for a constitutional convention that would produce one of Latin America's most progressive political documents, the Constitution of 1917. But before the Constitution could be born, the revolution needed to survive its darkest internal warfare, rising death tolls, and collapsing economy. The dreams of peasants, workers, and intellectuals depended on leaders whose visions often collided. Yet this struggle, brutal as it was, forged the foundations of modern Mexico. By late 1915 and into 1916, Mexico entered a crucial transition stage. The military tides had shifted dramatically, with Álvaro Obregón's strategic brilliance destroying Pancho Villa's battlefield dominance and Venustiano Carranza gaining control of the nation's capital. Yet victory over military rivals did not guarantee long-term peace. The revolution had spread new expectations across every layer of Mexican society. Peasants demanded land redistribution, Industrial workers demanded wages and rights. Women demanded dignity and participation, and students demanded democratic education. The country wanted the revolution to produce tangible change, not simply replace one elite class with another. Carranza understood these pressures. He realized that without a formal political document, revolutionary goals could dissolve into renewed conflict. To legitimize his rule and satisfy a war-weary nation, Carranza called for the creation of a new constitution that would correct the injustices of the Porfiriato and offer a lasting national framework for reform. The constitutionalist government issued a call for a constitutional convention in Querétaro in 1916. Delegates came from different social backgrounds: lawyers, teachers, small landowners, journalists, and military officers. Most were middle-class constitutionalists who admired Carranza, yet there was also a radical minority influenced by socialist and anarchist ideas. The convention opened with electric tension. Some delegates believed Mexico needed gradual reform, anchored in classical liberal doctrine like that of the 1857 Constitution. Others argued that Mexico required radical restructuring, protection for worker unions, land redistribution, limits on the Catholic Church, and stronger control over national resources. Within the walls of the convention hall, ideological debates mirrored the struggles that raged across the countryside. Delegates spoke passionately about the meaning of citizenship, the power of the state, and the rights of the poor. Many argued that Mexico could no longer deny the voices of indigenous communities, peasants, and factory workers whose blood fueled the revolution. Outside the convention, the nation remained unstable. Villa's influence diminished, yet his rebellion continued in scattered guerrilla operations. Zapata still controlled parts of Morelos and refused to recognize Carranza's legitimacy. The U.S. military presence inside Mexico, known as the Punitive Expedition, further complicated national politics. In March 1916, Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico, provoking the United States to send troops led by General Pershing into northern Mexico. Although Pershing failed to capture Villa, the invasion humiliated Mexico and increased nationalist sentiment. Convention delegates saw the U.S. incursion as proof that Mexico must assert sovereignty over its land and natural resources. Within this context, delegates debated Article 27, one of the most revolutionary legal articles in world history. It declared that subsoil resources such as oil, silver, minerals, and land belong to the Mexican nation. Foreign investors, especially U.S. and British companies, panicked. Industrial elites warned that such a vision would disrupt economic stability. But constitutional radicals insisted that Mexico had suffered long enough under foreign exploitation. They argued that the revolution must protect future generations from economic dependency. This battle of ideology reflected an emerging global awareness. Nations once dominated by imperial powers were beginning to fight for control over their own identities and livelihoods. The delegates' debates lasted months, filled with speeches, amendments, and emotional clashes. Yet despite disagreements, a shared hope united them. Mexico deserved a future where democracy and justice replaced tyranny. The convention moved steadily toward completion, preparing to create a document that would become the foundation of modern Mexican political life. The drafting process of the Constitution of 1917 forced Mexico to confront deep structural injustice that had existed since colonial times. The land question dominated discussions because the Mexican countryside had suffered the worst abuses. Under Porfirio Díaz, entire indigenous communities had been uprooted. Haciendas grew to massive sizes while villagers were pushed into debt slavery. Article 27 attempted to resolve this by declaring that the nation, not individuals, ultimately owned the land and natural wealth. It gave the state authority to redistribute territory, restore communal land to indigenous populations, and break up large estates. This article represented a radical departure from classical liberal property law. Yet it did more than address property. It represented emotional healing after centuries of humiliation. The Constitution also addressed labor rights through Article 123, another revolutionary contribution to world politics. Before the revolution, laborers in mines, factories, and railroad networks endured horrific working conditions. Children worked long hours, wages were low, and strikes were brutally suppressed by Diaz's rural police. Article 123 introduced an 8-hour workday, equal pay for equal work, protections for women and children, the right to strike, and mandatory rest days. In many ways, the Constitution anticipated international labor movements still decades away. Mexico was not merely imitating European social policies. It was leading Latin America into a new era of worker protection. Education reform became another pillar. The Constitution called for secular, free, and compulsory primary education. For centuries, education had been controlled primarily by the Catholic Church, and rural populations saw little benefit. The new system aimed to create a literate citizenry that could participate responsibly in democracy. Schools would reach remote villages, teaching Spanish, mathematics, civics, and culture to communities long excluded from literacy. This reform was transformative. It imagined education not as privilege, but as a national obligation. The role of the church itself became a fiercely debated topic. Many delegates remembered how conservative clergy supported Porfirian elites and opposed liberal governments in past decades. They argued the church should be separate from the state to protect democracy. The Constitution placed restrictions on religious involvement in public education, prohibited the church from owning certain types of property, and limited priests' political power. These measures later ignited religious conflict, especially during the Cristero War, but in 1917 delegates believed these safeguards were necessary to break centuries of clerical dominance. As debates continued, Carranza struggled to maintain unity. Some supporters found the Constitution too radical. Others thought it did not go far enough. Carranza himself was more cautious and moderate than the document ultimately reflected. But revolutionary pressure pushed the Constitution toward boldness. Delegates insisted that Mexico could not merely echo the past. It needed a future built upon justice. When the Constitution of 1917 was completed, it became a political miracle, a document so progressive that historians call it one of the first modern social constitutions in the world. It stood as a symbol of revolution turned into law. It honored Madero's democratic dream, carried Zapata's agrarian vision, incorporated Villa's regional pride, reflected Obregon's military realities, and expressed Carranza's legal order. It was imperfect, complicated, and controversial, but it represented hope. On February 5, 1917, the new Constitution was officially proclaimed in Querétaro. Crowds gathered to witness an event that symbolized the transformation of Mexico from a country ruled by dictatorship to one led by constitutional promise. Carranza emerged as the first president under the new legal framework, but the revolutionary decade was far from over. The Constitution did not magically unite the country. War scars remained vivid, bitterness persisted, and rival armies still held weapons. The document represented peace on paper, while Mexico continued to face hardship in reality. For peasants, the Constitution remained a promise rather than a completed victory. Zapata refused to accept Carranza's authority because the distribution of land moved slowly. In Morelos, Zapatista communities continued to seize haciendas and plant communal fields, believing that real revolution required action rather than legal language. Zapata viewed Carranza as another politician who valued political stability more than the people's hunger. His distrust deepened as Carranza launched military campaigns to suppress Zapatista regions. Villagers found themselves once again caught between ideals and gunfire. Villa, still furious over his military defeats, continued guerrilla raids. The punitive expedition withdrew from Mexico in 1917, but its presence left national humiliation. Villa turned increasingly unpredictable, attacking government forces and sometimes committing brutal acts that cost him public sympathy. He believed Carranza had betrayed revolutionary ideals and saw the Constitution as an elite project that ignored working-class suffering. Meanwhile, Carranza attempted to build a modern state. He reopened schools, expanded postal networks, rebuilt bridges and railroads, re-established government ministries, and attempted to restore economic stability. But his administration struggled with shortages, inflation, and political corruption. The revolution had destroyed industrial infrastructure, leaving the government with limited resources. The Constitution also reshaped Mexico's international role. Foreign investors worried Article 27 would force renegotiation of contracts in mining, agriculture, banking, and especially oil. Mexico's newly asserted economic sovereignty threatened U.S. and British corporate interests. Diplomatic pressure mounted, pushing Mexico into tense negotiations that would last years. Despite challenges, the Constitution symbolized a turning point. It brought intellectual cohesion to revolutionary goals and demonstrated that social reform could coexist with democratic structure. Even today, many articles from 1917 remain central to Mexican political identity. The document empowered future movements for worker rights, agrarian reform, and national cultural development. Yet revolution is never defined by one moment. After 1917, Mexico would still face betrayal, assassination, new civil conflicts, and unresolved class struggles. Zapata and Villa would not survive the decade. Carranza himself would later be overthrown. But the ideas born in this era, land reform, nationalism, social rights, popular education, labor protection, would continue shaping Mexico for generations. After the Constitution of 1917 emerged, Mexico should have entered a peaceful era defined by rebuilding and reform. But history shows that revolutions rarely end when laws are written. The Mexican Revolution, although now armed with a radical new constitution, continued to unravel through internal mistrust, ideological conflict, and political ambition. The social wounds of decades-long oppression could not heal overnight. Venustiano Carranza, now constitutionally elected president, discovered that victory brought as many dangers as defeat. Zapata and Villa continued to exist outside central authority, inspiring fear within government circles. Their towering reputations made them living legends in the eyes of peasants and living threats in the eyes of politicians. Carranza faced enormous pressure from every side. The urban middle class expected new schools, modern industries, and secure jobs. Peasants demanded immediate land redistribution. Workers expected Article 123's labor protections to improve conditions rapidly. Meanwhile, foreign oil companies pressured the Mexican government to protect their economic interests, and the United States carefully watched political changes from across the border. Carranza tried to balance these forces, but his cautious administrative style frustrated revolutionary radicals. He wanted gradual reform guided by law and economic calculation. Many believed he lacked empathy for the poor, while his conservative instincts alienated the working class and military leaders who had sacrificed blood during the revolution. Emiliano Zapata represented the greatest moral threat to Carranza's government. Zapata refused to disarm or compromise because he believed political institutions could not be trusted. His plan of Ayala was not empty rhetoric. It guided active land seizures across Morelos. Villages received land directly from Zapata's army rather than from bureaucratic officials. His authority came from community approval, not presidential decree. This fact bothered Carranza deeply because it challenged the foundation of central government. Carranza viewed Zapata as a rebel and a destabilizing force. To the people of Morelos, however, Zapata was the revolution's most authentic voice, the one leader who never betrayed the poor. Carranza assigned General Pablo Gonzalez to crush Zapatismo. The war between Gonzalez and Zapata turned Morelos into a zone of terror. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, civilians forced into labor camps, and thousands displaced. Carranza believed that eliminating Zapata would secure Mexico's future and force the nation into unity. The decision reveals something tragic. The revolution had reached a stage where revolutionaries were killing revolutionaries, not to overthrow dictatorship, but to control the direction of freedom. Meanwhile, Zapata tried to negotiate alliances with Villa and other rebels, but found communication difficult as federal troops tightened pressure. In 1918, another crisis shook Mexico, the global influenza pandemic. The Spanish flu spread across the country, killing tens of thousands. Already weakened by war, malnutrition, and displacement, Mexican communities suffered deeply. Hospitals overflowed, rural towns lacked medicine, and farmers died during harvest seasons, worsening food shortages. The pandemic intensified national exhaustion and amplified distrust. Many saw illness as punishment from heaven or viewed government campaigns as invasion. Social panic destabilized communities further and damaged agricultural production across central Mexico. Carranza believed the only path forward required eliminating Zapata. Government forces began using a strategy not just of war, but of psychological infiltration. They studied the trust systems within Zapatista villages and planned to exploit them. The assassination plot that followed would become one of the most painful turning points of the revolution. The plan targeted Zapata not through battle, but through deceit, a method reflecting how revolution had moved from ideals to brutal pragmatism. In 1919, the Mexican Revolution reached a moment that forever changed its memory. The assassination of Emiliano Zapata. Unlike many military leaders, Zapata had no interest in personal wealth or power. He saw himself as a guardian of peasant rights and indigenous identity. That purity inspired immense loyalty among campesinos, but it also made him a relentless enemy to Carranza's central government. Carranza's administration saw Zapata not as a national hero, but as an obstacle to modern nation building. As long as Zapata controlled Morelos, federal authority remained incomplete. General Pablo Gonzalez, eager to please Carranza, devised a plan using Colonel Jesus Guajardo, an officer whose reputation for discipline made him a believable figure. Guajardo pretended to rebel against Carranza and joined Zapata's movement. Zapata, trained by years of betrayal, remained cautious. But Guajardo gained trust by staging a false execution of Carrancista soldiers, shooting them with blanks while making Zapata think he had killed government loyalists. Zapata, witnessing this apparent act of rebellion, lowered his guard. He arranged a meeting at the Hacienda de Chinamica, believing a new alliance could strengthen resistance against federal forces. On April 10, 1919, Zapata entered the Hacienda courtyard surrounded by a small escort. Federal soldiers hid behind walls. As Zapata walked toward Guajardo, the soldiers opened fire. The revolutionary who had dedicated his life to justice fell under a rain of bullets. Zapata's body was displayed publicly so the government could prove his death and destroy any hope of resurrection myth. The image shocked Mexico. Even those who opposed his methods respected his integrity. His assassination represented the death of rural revolutionary purity, and many historians argue that Zapata's death marked the symbolic end of the revolution's most idealistic dream. In Morelos, villagers reacted with profound grief and rage. Some saw Zapata's death as martyrdom, others as a continuation of centuries-long oppression. Yet the assassination did not end Zapatismo. Communities continued farming collectively, printing pamphlets, and resisting government forces. Zapata's image transformed from rebel leader to eternal symbol of agrarian justice. His motto, "Land and Liberty," spread across Latin America. He inspired later struggles for indigenous rights, socialist movements, and 20th century peasant uprisings. Zapata became larger than life, an icon etched into murals, music, and textbooks. While Zapata's supporters mourned, Carranza and his advisors believed they had eliminated their greatest threat. They assumed political consolidation would follow. But instead, Zapata's assassination destabilized national trust further. Revolutionary generals who had once supported Carranza began doubting his moral legitimacy. If Carranza could assassinate the revolution's most ethical leader, what would stop him from attacking others? This fear eventually drove military leaders to reconsider alliances. Pancho Villa was perhaps the most unpredictable figure of this period. His guerrilla operations continued in the north, but his influence had diminished. Villa watched Zapata's fate with alarm. He understood that if Carranza strengthened his control, Villa would be next. Still, his forces were too scattered to mount a large-scale rebellion. Villa spent 1919 attempting negotiations, occasionally raiding and surviving government attacks. Meanwhile, Álvaro Obregón, the brilliant general who defeated Villa in 1915, began planning his own political future. Obregón believed Carranza was leading Mexico into stagnation rather than reconstruction. He also believed the revolution must now focus on social reforms promised by the Constitution. Although Carranza had once been Obregón's ally, tensions built between them. Obregón intended to run for the presidency in 1920, hoping democratic transition would solidify the revolution. Carranza, however, feared Obregón's popularity and began searching for ways to block his candidacy. This decision triggered another storm. Thus, Zapata's death did not end Mexico's internal conflict. It opened the door to a new political crisis, one driven not by ideology alone, but by the clash of ambition, old wounds, and constitutional uncertainty. The final years of the revolution unfolded through treachery, ambition, and transformation. After Zapata's assassination, Carranza faced deepening political isolation. Many revolutionary leaders now believed he had abandoned the spirit of change for authoritarian control. Carranza's government struggled to rebuild the economy. Railroads were still damaged, farms lacked equipment, livestock herds were depleted, and national industries had not recovered. Inflation weakened salaries. Urban workers launched strikes demanding Article 123 rights be honored. Rural communities lost patience waiting for land reform. In this climate of disappointment, Álvaro Obregón emerged as a powerful alternative to Carranza. Unlike Carranza, Obregón enjoyed strong relationships with labor organizations, teachers, intellectuals, and veterans. He had charisma, military prestige, and modern political vision. Obregón believed Mexico required structural reform, industrial cooperation, and mass education. Carranza feared Obregón's popularity and attempted to control the upcoming presidential election of 1920. Instead of supporting Obregón, Carranza chose Ignacio Bonales, an obscure diplomat living abroad. This decision outraged military and civilian leaders alike. They felt Carranza was betraying democracy to protect personal power. Obregón, backed by Generals Adolfo de la Huerta and Plutarco Elias Calles, launched the plan of Agua Prieta in April 1920, a military rebellion to overthrow Carranza. Dozens of regional commanders joined them. Carranza fled Mexico City, hoping to establish a provisional government elsewhere. He carried national treasury funds, attempting to regroup as he escaped toward Veracruz. But his supporters deserted him. On May 21st, 1920, Carranza was ambushed and killed in Tlaxcalantongo. His death symbolized the inevitable downfall of leaders who lost revolutionary legitimacy. Following Carranza's assassination, Adolfo de la Huerta became interim president. He negotiated peace with Villa, offering him amnesty and land for retirement. Villa accepted the agreement and withdrew from political struggle. Years later, in 1923, Villa would also be assassinated, closing another revolutionary chapter. Obregón ran for president and won, beginning what many historians call the institutional phase of the revolution. Álvaro Obregón's presidency marked a shift away from civil war and toward nation building. He prioritized rebuilding agriculture, reforming education, restoring infrastructure, and stabilizing the economy. Obregón supported schoolteacher José Vasconcelos in launching a vast cultural renaissance, focusing on literacy, muralism, indigenous celebration, and national identity. Mexico entered a period of intellectual rebirth. New artists like Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros turned public walls into history books. Murals honoring Zapata, Villa, indigenous farmers, and revolutionary martyrs appeared across cities, shaping public memory. Yet the revolution also kept its darker shadows. Land reform remained slow, inequality persisted, and political assassinations did not disappear. Still, the chaos of constant warfare finally ended. The revolution transitioned from battlefield violence to political negotiation, party formation, and constitutional evolution. By 1920, the Mexican Revolution, 10 years long, bloody, chaotic, and transformative, had altered the nation forever. A century of elite dominance was shattered. Indigenous identity re-emerged with pride. Workers gained rights. The state asserted control over natural resources. Mexico became a modern republic built upon revolutionary sacrifice. But this story is not over. The revolution continued shaping national identity for decades, and its legacies would echo through land reforms under Lázaro Cárdenas, cultural achievements, political parties, and social movements. What began with men like Madero, Zapata, Villa, and Carranza did not end with their deaths. Their visions fused into a national identity, proud, complex, multicultural, and determined to define justice on its own terms. The Mexican Revolution did not abruptly end with Carranza's death in 1920. Instead, the country entered a long period of reconstruction and ideological consolidation. Álvaro Obregón's presidency signaled a turning point where Mexico shifted away from the chaos of war and began transforming revolutionary dreams into practical reform. The Mexican people were exhausted emotionally, physically, and economically. Fields were overgrown, railroads broken, schools empty, and countless families had lost fathers, sons, or property. Obregón inherited a nation traumatized, yet hopeful, aware that the revolution had opened doors to change, but uncertain how to walk through them. Obregón understood that Mexico needed stability before true reform could endure. His first task was to restore legitimacy and trust between the national government and the population. Rather than continue endless military struggle, he chose negotiation. One of his greatest political achievements came in 1920 when he made peace with Pancho Villa. Villa, whose rebellious spirit shaped northern revolutionary culture, agreed to retire to the hacienda of Canutillo with land, money, and immunity from prosecution. This deal removed a potential threat and signaled that compromise, not war, would lead the country forward. Although Villa remained a larger-than-life figure, his withdrawal from political conflict helped Mexico breathe for the first time in years. Another component of Obregón's early leadership involved rebuilding the economy. Agricultural production had collapsed during the war. Haciendas lay abandoned, irrigation systems deteriorated, and livestock numbers had fallen drastically. Peasant villages struggled to grow enough corn to survive, let alone pay taxes. Obregón's government distributed seeds and farming tools, repaired irrigation canals, and encouraged communal land use. Although land reform would expand more significantly under later administrations, Obregón laid structural foundations that allowed farmers to envision new possibilities. Perhaps the greatest legacy of his presidency lies in the educational reforms guided by José Vasconcelos, appointed Minister of Public Education. Vasconcelos believed Mexico could not rebuild without cultural unity and literacy. He launched rural school programs, literacy campaigns, textbook publishing, and teacher training. Schools opened in remote regions where education had never existed. The goal was not merely academic learning, but cultural transformation. Instill pride in indigenous heritage, teach history that honored peasants and revolutionaries, and create a Mexican identity independent of European standards. This intellectual awakening inspired a cultural renaissance across Mexico. Vasconcelos funded mural projects designed to educate the public visually, especially those who could not yet read. Artists like Diego Rivera painted giant murals depicting indigenous farmers, revolutionary battles, and workers in factories. José Clemente Orozco illustrated human suffering and social injustice with emotional intensity, while David Alfaro Siqueiros experimented with political realism and public art. These murals gave ordinary citizens access to national storytelling. Instead of elite history books, public art became the textbook of the people. Obregón also addressed labor issues. Article 123 of the 1917 Constitution promised workers new rights, but implementation required new institutions. Obregón legalized labor unions, encouraged collective bargaining, and allowed strikes. Workers gained confidence and began forming new identities as organized political actors. For the first time, factory workers, railroad employees, miners, and dock laborers felt the state recognized their humanity and economic value. Still, tensions persisted. Landowners resisted losing property. Conservative Catholics opposed secular education programs. Foreign oil investors clashed with nationalist policies, fearing state control of petroleum. Political assassinations, though less frequent, did not vanish from Mexican life. Some generals resented Obregón's civilian authority and hoped to maintain military influence. Yet despite these challenges, Obregón guided Mexico through one of its brightest transitional eras. He balanced reform with stability, culture with politics, and social progress with economic pragmatism. His presidency became a bridge between civil war and institutional modernization, a moment when Mexicans began imagining themselves as part of a nation defined not by chaos, but by creativity and law. The years 1921 to 1924 represent a period of intense political complexity. Although Obregón's government reduced violence, Mexico still faced internal struggles over interpretation of the revolution. Political factions debated what revolutionary victory truly demanded. Was the revolution primarily about land redistribution, or about empowering workers, or about building a strong, centralized state to guide national development? These questions shaped every policy decision made by the Obregón administration. Land remained the most charged issue. Under Obregón, land redistribution programs began cautiously. The government returned territories to villages that had proven historical ownership, particularly in states like Morelos and Michoacán. However, large hacienda owners resisted reform, relying on legal obstruction, bribery, and appeals to international investors. Many landowners believed the revolution was temporary chaos and hoped to restore their old power by waiting. They underestimated the depth of agrarian resentment. When peasants saw delays, they protested, petitioned, and sometimes seized land illegally. The government faced pressure to expand ejido farming, yet feared economic instability if haciendas collapsed too suddenly. Meanwhile, education reform transformed social life. Vasconcelos viewed education as a cultural revolution equal to a military one. He sent teachers to remote indigenous regions, where they learned local languages and taught reading, writing, mathematics, and national history. Schools also promoted hygiene, nutrition, music, and physical education. Many parents feared the government intended to erase traditional customs, while others celebrated new opportunities. Education challenged regional isolation and created a sense of shared national identity. At the same time, Mexico experienced a boom in intellectual production. Newspaper circulation increased, publishing companies flourished, and universities expanded enrollment. Writers explored revolutionary memory, indigenous identity, and social class struggle. Intellectuals debated Marxism, nationalism, secularism, and feminism. Women's activism grew stronger during these years. Women had fought in the revolution as soldiers, spies, couriers, and nurses, yet received little political recognition afterward. Feminist voices demanded voting rights, property rights, and access to higher education. Although Mexico did not grant women full suffrage until 1953, discussions during Obregón's term laid essential groundwork. Labor movements also surged. Workers formed new unions and organized strikes, testing Article 123. Obregón generally supported these activities, believing they helped reduce social inequality. However, foreign corporations, especially in mining and oil industries, resisted wage increases and safety regulations. This tension strained relations between Mexico and the United States. American businessmen feared Mexico was heading towards socialism. Some U.S. newspapers portrayed Obregón as a radical. In reality, he was pragmatic, negotiating agreements that protected Mexican sovereignty while maintaining trade partnerships. The Catholic Church posed another political challenge. Clergy members opposed secular education and argued the government violated religious freedom. Priests warned villagers that secular reforms threatened moral values. The government accused the church of trying to weaken the revolution. This conflict never erupted fully during Obregón's term, but the seeds planted would later fuel the violent Cristero War under President Plutarco Elias Calles. Foreign policy also shaped Mexico's direction. Obregón worked to gain diplomatic recognition from the United States. Recognition was essential for international loans and economic stability. But U.S. officials demanded guarantees that Article 27 would not harm foreign oil companies. Negotiations resulted in the Bucareli Agreements of 1923, allowing pre-1917 oil investments to remain under old legal protections. Many Mexicans criticized this compromise as a betrayal of revolutionary nationalism, while others saw it as a necessary step toward diplomatic stability. Political conflict exploded near the end of Obregón's presidency. Adolfo de la Huerta, who once served as interim president, felt betrayed by Obregón and Calles. De la Huerta launched a rebellion in 1923, drawing support from military officers who feared losing power to civilian rule. The uprising spread across multiple states, and fighting resumed briefly. But Obregón crushed the rebellion with the same strategic mastery he once used on Villa. Its defeat confirmed civilian supremacy and cleared the path for Calles to become the next president. As Obregón's term neared its end, Mexico prepared for a new phase in revolutionary state building. The 1917 Constitution required presidents to step down after one term to prevent dictatorship, so Obregón could not remain in power legally. Instead, he supported the presidential candidacy of Plutarco Elias Calles, a fellow Sonoran revolutionary and trusted ally. Calles shared Obregón's vision of modernization, nationalism, and governmental centralization. His election in 1924 represented continuity, but also signaled a shift towards stronger state authority. Calles fast enormes expectations. Mexicans wanted rapid land redistribution, educational expansion, economic modernization, labor rights, and political stability simultaneously. The nation had survived civil war, dictatorship, coups, assassinations, and social collapse. Now it demanded prosperity, but progress required institutional strength. Calles aimed to build a state able to enforce constitutional laws rather than rely on charismatic generals. During this transitional period, Mexico experienced cultural transformation. Revolutionary songs, murals, photographs, and novels flooded public life, shaping national consciousness. Murals inside government buildings taught history to illiterate populations, portraying the revolution as a heroic struggle of workers, peasants, and indigenous communities against foreign oppressors and local elites. These visual narratives reshaped public memory, ensuring that figures like Zapata and Villa were remembered as defenders of justice rather than outlaws. Indigenous culture gained in national recognition. Unlike Porfirian governments that viewed indigenous traditions as obstacles to progress, revolutionary Mexico promoted indigenous languages, art, and community structures. Anthropologists studied ancient civilizations, while museums showcased Maya, Aztec, and Tarascan heritage. This cultural pride strengthened national unity, reminding Mexicans that their identity was older than colonial conquest and richer than foreign influence. Still, darker unresolved conflicts lingered beneath the surface. Land reform remained far slower than promised. Agrarian peasants faced bureaucracy, insufficient funding, and political favoritism. Women continued to struggle for equal rights despite their contributions to the revolution. Industrial workers, empowered by new unions, demanded higher wages, sparking conflict with factory owners. Rural regions lacked infrastructure, hospitals, and transportation networks. Political stability remained fragile. Assassinations lurked behind public celebration. Although Villa withdrew from politics under Obregón, enemies killed him in 1923, continuing a tragic revolutionary pattern. Zapata, Madero, Carranza, Villa, nearly every major revolutionary leader had died violently. The revolution proved long-lasting not only because of ideas, but because no one agreed on how far those ideas should go. Obregón left office in 1924 confident he had guided Mexico through its most fragile transition, but history would show the revolution far from finished. The country still had to face religious conflict, economic crisis, authoritarian tendencies, and ideological battles that would shape the 20th century. Yet the achievements of Obregon's era cannot be underestimated. He laid educational foundations, integrated labor into national policy, fostered cultural pride, strengthened central authority, ended major rebellions, and proved constitutional democracy could function in Mexico. He also demonstrated that revolutionary ideals could coexist with state building. This combination shaped modern Mexico, inspiring future leaders and echoing through later reforms. Mexico, now under Calles, prepared to confront its next turbulent chapter, a chapter defined by church-state conflict, political restructuring, and evolving revolutionary vision. When Plutarco Elias Calles took office in 1924, Mexico entered a complex stage defined by ideological confrontation, modernization efforts, and the struggle to turn revolutionary momentum into institutional strength. While Obregon emphasized social reconciliation, Calles leaned toward structural control. He believed Mexico could not advance without a strong central government capable of enforcing laws across every region. This approach made him a controversial figure, admired by some for discipline and order, despised by others for authoritarian tendencies. Calles inherited a nation still recovering from years of war. Railroads, rural schools, agricultural fields, and communication networks demanded urgent repair. Inflation remained unstable, and unemployment threatened social unrest. Yet Calles approached leadership with bold ambition. His government aimed to industrialize Mexico, modernize agriculture, regulate banking, and reduce foreign economic control. Calles also pushed literacy campaigns, expanded rural education, and supported cultural projects. These efforts reflected continuity with Obregon's reforms, but Calles' harsh political style created new divisions. The greatest conflict during Calles' presidency revolved around church-state relations. Decades earlier, liberal governments had separated church and state legally, but Porfirio Díaz tolerated Catholic influence in exchange for political peace. After the revolution, anti-clerical sentiments returned with new force. Many revolutionaries believed the Catholic Church represented authoritarian tradition, colonial legacy, and foreign interference. Article 130 of the 1917 Constitution restricted the political and economic power of clergy, but most leaders avoided enforcing these laws aggressively. Calles chose to enforce them without compromise. In 1926, he passed the Calles Law, mandating strict government oversight of religious activity. Priests were required to register with the state, religious schools were closed, public worship was regulated, and foreign-born clergy were expelled. Calles believed he was defending the Constitution and protecting national sovereignty. But for Catholics, especially rural communities, this policy felt like an attack on faith, family identity, and cultural tradition. Resistance appeared immediately. Bishops protested, priests refused to register, and Catholic lay organizations encouraged civil disobedience. Calles responded with military suppression, mass arrests, and closing churches. Conflict escalated rapidly because the church held profound emotional influence among ordinary people. In rural states like Jalisco, Michoacán, Guanajuato, and Zacatecas, Catholic devotion blended with regional identity. Local communities viewed the priest not merely as a religious leader, but as a social link to weddings, funerals, moral guidance, music, festivals, and education. When Calles attempted to silence the clergy, villagers believed their entire cultural existence was under attack. By late 1926, rebellion erupted. Armed groups calling themselves Cristeros took up rifles, shouting the slogan, "Viva Cristo Rey." They attacked government soldiers, sabotaged railroads, and seized small towns. This uprising soon developed into the Cristero War, one of the most violent religious conflicts in the Americas. Thousands died, civilians suffered brutal repression, and villages were burned as both sides believed they fought for moral survival. Calles insisted the rebellion was treasonous and used the military to restore order. As conflict spread, Mexico's international reputation became entangled. The United States, though historically Protestant and wary of Mexican nationalism, feared instability near its southern border and worried that anti-clerical violence could disrupt oil investments. Diplomats attempted to mediate, urging compromise, but Calles resisted foreign pressure. The revolution had taught Mexican leaders to distrust outside influence. Economically, Calles faced significant challenges. Industrial growth required foreign loans and investment, yet nationalist policies restricted corporate freedom. Mexico needed capital to build roads, factories, power plants, and schools. Calles attempted to create a modern banking system and a national development program. But political turbulence discouraged investors, leading to slow economic expansion. Efforts to mechanize agriculture remained limited because most farmers still relied on traditional tools and ancestral techniques. Despite these obstacles, Calles continued shaping Mexico's ideological direction. He strongly promoted secular education and scientific thinking, believing superstition and clerical authority hindered progress. Teachers in rural villages became revolutionary missionaries, spreading literacy and nationalism. In some regions, teachers clashed violently with Catholic villagers, symbolizing the cultural divide tearing Mexico apart. Meanwhile, political tensions grew inside revolutionary ranks. Many generals believed Calles' anti-clerical policy endangered national unity. Others admired his courage. Some feared that the revolution risked becoming a dictatorship, especially when Calles began removing opponents from government posts. Yet few openly confronted him, because Calles controlled the military and intelligence networks. By 1927, Mexico stood at a crossroads, a nation balancing revolutionary modernism on one side and traditional spirituality on the other. Calles believed the church must surrender political power. Catholics believed the state was committing moral tyranny. This tension proved that the revolution, though legally victorious, continued reshaping Mexican identity at its deepest cultural roots. While the Cristero conflict dominated national consciousness, Calles also attempted to institutionalize the revolution politically. Before his presidency, Mexico's political system relied heavily on personal alliances. Leaders such as Zapata, Villa, and Obregón commanded armies based on charisma and regional loyalty. Calles understood that without an organized political structure, Mexico could easily fall back in a caudillismo, ruled by regional warlords. His long-term vision was to build a state strong enough to outlive individual rulers. One major step toward this goal came in 1928, when Calles encouraged the formation of a political party that could unify revolutionary factions. This organization would later evolve into the National Revolutionary Party, PNR, the ancestor of the modern PRI, a party that dominated Mexican politics for more than 7 decades. At the time, few recognized how profoundly this decision would shape the future. The party system allowed Mexico to channel political rivalry into elections rather than warfare. However, forming a national party required unity, and unity was disappearing rapidly. The Cristero War strained resources and polarized communities. Schools burned, churches emptied, and neighbors turned against each other. Some families supported the government. Others hid Cristero rebels. Religious violence created emotional wounds that would last generations. Peasants who once fought for land now fought for access to sacraments and religious ceremony. Catholic women became powerful organizers, distributing food, medicine, and messages across rebel territory. Meanwhile, economic pressures intensified. Global markets shifted as the United States entered the Roaring '20s. Mexican workers demanded wage increases to match rising living costs. Urban strikes emerged, particularly in oil and rail industries. Calles struggled to balance worker demands with foreign investor pressure. The government wanted sovereignty, but also needed American financial support to rebuild infrastructure. This dilemma symbolized a broader question haunting post-revolutionary Mexico. How could the nation protect revolutionary values while integrating into global capitalism? Calles' personal leadership style triggered additional controversy. Many viewed him as increasingly authoritarian. He controlled military appointments, censored critics, and intervened in congressional decisions. Supporters argued Mexico needed strong leadership to survive internal rebellions and external threats. Critics feared dictatorship, noting that the revolution began as a rebellion against authoritarianism. Obregon's return to politics in 1928 escalated tension. The Constitution prohibited presidential re-election, yet Congress amended it to allow Obregon to run again. Many believed Obregon's second term would restore stability. Others worried that re-election revived Porfirian patterns. Calles supported Obregon officially, but observers suspected rivalry beneath the surface. After all, Obregon enjoyed massive popularity and military respect, qualities that could overshadow Calles. On July 17, 1928, tragedy struck. Obregon, having won the election, attended a celebratory banquet in Mexico City. A young assassin named Jose de Leon Torral shot and killed him. Torral was influenced by Cristero ideology and believed Obregon represented tyranny against Catholicism. The assassination shocked the nation. A newly elected president, a revolutionary hero, murdered before taking office. It felt like the revolution's curse. Every major figure who rose to power eventually fell through violence. Obregon's death left Mexico leaderless and unstable. The nation faced a dangerous political vacuum. Calles could not legally return to the presidency, but he refused to relinquish control. Instead, he shaped a new role for himself, one that would define the next era. The Chief Maximo, the maximum chief commanding the government from behind the scenes. This transformation marked the beginning of the Maximato, a period of indirect rule by Calles, lasting until 1934. During this phase, presidents served in name, but Calles dictated national policy. Some viewed him as a stabilizing guardian of revolutionary order. Others saw him as a shadow dictator. Either way, Mexico entered a new chapter where institutions mattered more than individual warlords. Yet personal ambition remained powerful beneath the surface. The assassination of Obregon in 1928 not only reshaped political leadership, it deeply transformed national psychology. Mexicans felt a haunting sense of repetition. Every time the country approached peace, violence dragged it backward. Madero's assassination in 1913, Zapata's in 1919, Carranza's in 1920, Villa's in 1923, and now Obregon's in 1928 built a narrative that leadership in Mexico was lethal. The revolution had promised democracy, yet political murder remained its defining inheritance. In this environment of instability, Calles maneuvered skillfully to maintain control. He recognized that open dictatorship would provoke national backlash, but a disguised power structure could preserve stability. Thus, the Maximato began. From 1928 to 1934, Mexico saw three different presidents: Emilio Portes Gil, Pascual Ortiz Rubio, and Abelardo L. Rodriguez. Yet Calles orchestrated their policies from behind the scenes. He made cabinet appointments, shaped economic priorities, supervised military command, and influenced Congress. While Calles strengthened the state, everyday Mexicans continued suffering under the Cristero War. Fighting dragged on, and villages bled resources. Priests were scarce, sacraments forbidden, schools destroyed, and trade routes unsafe. Yet Mexico could not abandon modernization. Calles pushed secular schools, agricultural reform, and industrial development even during wartime. Porfirio Díaz, the first Maximado president, helped negotiate the end of the Cristero conflict in 1929, mediated by U.S. Ambassador Dwight Morrow. Through diplomacy, the government restored limited religious rights while maintaining constitutional authority. Priests could resume worship under state regulation, and villages regained access to sacraments. Although not everyone felt satisfied, the peace agreement allowed healing. Simultaneously, Calles focused on long-term economic transformation. He created the Bank of Mexico in 1925 prior to Obregon's re-election victory to stabilize currency and regulate national credit. Under his extended influence, the nation expanded highways, improved ports, and increased electricity access. Industries like banking, textile production, and brewing grew. Mexico slowly transitioned from a rural, war-damaged economy into a semi-industrial society. Yet authoritarian patterns troubled many revolutionaries. The press suffered censorship, labor unions faced political pressure, and agrarian reform remained slow. Peasants felt betrayed because promises of land distribution still lagged behind expectations. Many recognized that the revolution, once driven by peasant armies, now served urban bureaucratic elites. This disconnect fueled rural frustration that future presidents would later address. Despite Calles' strict control, cracks appeared within the ruling class. Some leaders believe Calles pushed the revolution away from its social justice roots. Young reformists envisioned deeper land reform, free union organization, and indigenous empowerment. Tension brewed silently, waiting for the emergence of someone strong enough to challenge Calles' authority. That person would soon arrive, Lázaro Cárdenas, a governor from Michoacán, who would later redefine revolutionary meaning. Before that transformation, Mexico faced early signs of global economic crisis. The late 1920s saw falling commodity prices, shrinking export markets, and rising unemployment. Mexico relied heavily on oil, silver, and agricultural exports for revenue. When world markets weakened, national income declined. The warning signs intensified as the United States approached the Great Depression. Mexico was financially vulnerable, and the revolution had not yet created diverse economic strength. Politically, the newly formed PNR gave Mexico a peaceful structure for presidential succession. Elite bargains replaced violent coups. Yet this stability depended on Calles, not entirely on democratic devotion. The revolution continued evolving into a state ideology rather than a battlefield struggle. Murals, public ceremonies, textbooks, and songs glorified revolutionary identity. Mexico was learning to remember its violent past while packaging it into a unifying national myth. By 1928, the story of the revolution changed shape. It was no longer driven by Zapata's land struggles, Villa's cavalry charges, or Carranza's constitutional battles. It had entered institutional territory, where generals became politicians, rebels became lawmakers, and visions of justice entered bureaucratic halls. But as the Maximado advanced, another transformation prepared to unfold, one that would push Mexico into radical social reform under President Lázaro Cárdenas. By the early 1930s, Mexico stood on the edge of dramatic transformation. Although the Mexican Revolution had created new political structures and constitutional guarantees, profound social inequality persisted. Much of the countryside remained in poverty. Foreign corporations still controlled crucial economic sectors. Worker rights faced suppression, and indigenous communities struggled for cultural recognition. Meanwhile, the Maximado, Calles' shadow rule over presidents, left many Mexicans questioning whether the revolution had betrayed its democratic promises. Into this complex environment rose Lázaro Cárdenas, a quiet yet determined leader from Michoacán. Cárdenas was not charismatic in the traditional military sense. He lacked Villa's fiery oratory and Zapata's poetic symbolism. But he possessed something equally powerful: discipline, empathy, intellect, and moral purpose. His revolutionary background shaped him profoundly. Cárdenas served in the revolution as a young soldier, rose through army ranks, became a respected governor, and developed a deep connection to peasants and indigenous culture. Unlike many urban politicians, he spent time in rural villages listening to grievances rather than lecturing. This connection to people made him extraordinarily popular with the masses, even before he took office as president in 1934. Calles expected Cárdenas to act as a loyal subordinate, another president he could control behind the scenes. But Cárdenas had different intentions from the moment he arrived in Mexico City. He envisioned a true social revolution that fulfilled promises made decades earlier. To achieve this, he knew he had to break Calles' political domination. Slowly, through strategic appointments, public speeches, and regional alliances, Cárdenas built an independent power base. In 1935, he made a decisive move. After exposing Calles' increasing influence over government ministries and uncovering plots to manipulate political institutions, Cárdenas ordered the expulsion of Calles from the country. The public rejoiced. Mexico witnessed a symbolic second revolution, the overthrow of authoritarian shadow rule. Cárdenas proved the presidency was not a ceremonial role, but a position of leadership capable of restoring democratic intention. With Calles removed, Cárdenas began implementing sweeping reforms. Land distribution accelerated on a scale unseen since independence. Millions of acres were redistributed to peasants through ejidos, communal agricultural collectives supported by government infrastructure, loans, and training. Unlike forced seizures or chaotic occupation, Cárdenas planned reform methodically. He understood that land alone meant nothing if farmers lacked resources to cultivate it. Thus, he built roads into rural regions, provided tractors and irrigation supplies, and expanded agricultural education. This massive restructuring of rural Mexico reshaped national identity. Villagers who once labored under hacienda overlords now operated communal land systems that reflected Zapata's earliest dreams. Indigenous farming traditions re-emerged with dignity. Rural children attended schools for the first time. Literacy spread, shaping new generations who could read political newspapers and participate in civic life. Labor reform strengthened at the same time. Cárdenas recognized industrial workers as central to national development. He encouraged labor union growth, supported collective bargaining, and legalized strikes that demanded better working conditions. Workers in railroads, mining, petroleum, and textile production joined expanding national unions. These organizations became political partners in Cárdenas' vision. However, Cárdenas' most iconic achievement emerged in national resource sovereignty. Foreign oil companies, primarily from the United States and Britain, controlled nearly all petroleum revenue in Mexico. They resisted wage increases from Mexican workers, failed to pay taxes fairly, and operated with near-colonial arrogance. Oil was the economic heart of the nation, yet Mexico profited little from it. Labor strikes erupted when companies refused government arbitration. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of workers, but the companies still refused to comply. Cardenas realized foreign corporations were challenging national independence itself. On March 18, 1938, he delivered one of the most famous speeches in Mexican history, announcing the nationalization of Mexico's oil industry. Petroleum resources would now belong to Mexicans alone. This decision electrified the nation. Crowds celebrated across plazas, school children marched with flags, and musicians composed songs praising national dignity. Women donated jewelry and family heirlooms to symbolically support the new company, Pemex, during its first financial struggle. Although foreign governments denounced nationalization, Cardenas stood firm. International pressure could have collapsed Mexico's economy, but global geopolitical changes, including World War II, later gave Mexico stronger bargaining power. Cardenas's policies created the foundation of modern Mexican independence. His presidency marked a second phase of the revolution, the transition from armed rebellion to economic liberation and social reconstruction. Cardenas's land reform programs marked one of the most ambitious social transformations in 20th century Latin America. Before his presidency, most agricultural land remained in large estates owned by elites. Many peasants worked under exploitative sharecropping conditions, earning barely enough to survive. The revolution had promised change, but progress was slow. Under Cardenas, transformation moved swiftly. Over 45 million acres were distributed to ejidos. This redistribution altered Mexico's rural power structure permanently. Ejido farming offered advantages beyond ownership. These collective farms encouraged cooperation, shared equipment, and joint decision-making. Farmers learned new agricultural techniques through rural education programs. The government invested in roads, irrigation canals, and grain storage facilities. Cardenas even encouraged regional crop specialization. Corn in central Mexico, livestock in northern ranching zones, sugarcane in tropical climates, and coffee in mountainous regions. But land redistribution also faced obstacles. Many ejidos lacked machinery to reach full productivity, and soil conditions varied. Some communities lacked experience in cooperative management and struggled to resolve internal disputes. Credit loans did not always reach remote areas, and political corruption sometimes interfered with resource distribution. Yet despite limitations, the reforms succeeded in reshaping Mexican social life. Education played a powerful role alongside agrarian reform. Cardenas expanded rural schooling dramatically. Teachers, often called cultural missionaries, traveled on foot or horseback to isolated villages. They taught reading, writing, health, hygiene, civic participation, and national identity. Unlike earlier secular teachers who faced hostility during Calles' presidency, many Cardenista educators approached rural communities respectfully, honoring local traditions. Schools taught Mexican history from an indigenous perspective, celebrating Aztec and Maya heritage rather than portraying European colonial superiority. This transformation created new cultural pride. Children learned that their ancestors built pyramids, invented complex mathematics, and developed cosmologies rivaling Greek philosophy. Murals in public schools depicted indigenous villages, Zapata's revolution, and factory workers building modern cities. These images created a unified Mexican identity, blending past and present. At the same time, industrial development expanded. Railways grew, connecting farming regions to markets. Electricity spread to rural towns. Public works agencies paved roads, built dams, and constructed irrigation systems. Cardenas also invited foreign engineers to help design hydroelectric stations, believing energy independence was crucial for future growth. Labor rights expanded significantly. The Confederation of Mexican Workers, CTM, emerged as the nation's largest labor union, tightly linked to the government. Unlike previous administrations that repressed unions, Cardenas embraced them. His strategy aimed to balance capitalist industry with socialist labor demands, preventing class domination by elites. But the oil nationalization of 1938 stood above all other accomplishments. It represented economic self-determination rarely achieved in Latin America. The United States and Britain imposed boycotts. Major companies refused to sell Mexico machinery or technicians. Yet citizens rallied in support. Students donated weekly allowances to fund Pemex. Housewives organized relief kitchens. Musicians performed in plazas to raise money. This unity reflected a cultural shift. Mexicans stopped seeing themselves as victims of foreign exploitation and began believing they could shape their own destiny. Internationally, Cardenas' stance influenced global decolonization movements. Many leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America later cited Mexico's oil nationalization as proof that colonial economic structures could be dismantled. Despite overwhelming success, Cardenas faced criticism from conservatives, wealthy landowners, and international business leaders. Some argued land redistribution lowered agricultural productivity. Others claimed union power threatened economic stability. Foreign newspapers predicted Mexico would collapse without foreign oil management. History, however, proved the critics wrong. Mexico not only survived, it built a sustainable national economy grounded in sovereignty rather than dependency. Socially, Cardenas transformed peasant identity. People who once lived in isolation now belonged to a national movement. They participated in community meetings, voted in elections, read newspapers, and organized cooperatives. This cultural empowerment achieved what armies and rifles alone could not: permanent social transformation. As Cardenas continued reform, Mexico confronted deep questions about the revolution's legacy. Could the nation maintain equality, justice, and freedom once charismatic leaders stepped aside? Could agrarian reform remain strong without presidential protection? How would Mexico integrate industrial capitalism with socialist land ownership? Cardenas addressed these questions with remarkable foresight. Rather than cling to power beyond his term, he respected constitutional democracy. In 1940, he stepped down voluntarily, a dramatic contrast to leaders like Díaz, Huerta, and even Calles. His retirement strengthened democratic precedent and prevented Mexico from slipping back into dictatorship. Before leaving office, Cardenas restructured Mexico's political party into the Party of the Mexican Revolution, PRM, which incorporated peasants, workers, the army, and popular organizations into separate branches. This corporatist model aimed to ensure long-term political participation without civil war. While later decades revealed flaws, such as corruption, patronage, and lack of opposition competition, the model brought decades of stability that earlier Mexicans had never experienced. Cardenas also strengthened indigenous rights. He recognized native languages, preserved cultural festivals, and protected communal autonomy. Unlike previous governments, he avoided forcing indigenous assimilation into Spanish-speaking identity. Internationally, Cardenas resisted fascism. As Europe plunged into World War II, he condemned Nazi ideology and welcomed thousands of Spanish Republican refugees fleeing Franco's dictatorship. These refugees enriched Mexican cultural life, contributing to literature, cinema, architecture, and science. Yet even with monumental achievements, Mexico still faced problems when Cardenas left office. Many rural ejidos remained economically weak. Urban expansion created new inequality. Rapid industrialization produced wealth gaps between city workers and countryside laborers. Mexico remained dependent on U.S. trade and investment. Population growth strained housing and education. And although much land had been redistributed, capital shortages limited productivity in some regions. Still, none of these problems erased the revolution's victories. By 1940, Mexico looked nothing like the nation that existed in 1910. A new sense of dignity permeated national identity. The land no longer belonged exclusively to wealthy hacendados or foreign companies. Schools reached every corner of the country. Labor unions participated in national decisions. Indigenous identity became a source of pride, not shame. Mexican nationalism flourished. Cardenas's legacy also reshaped global revolutionary strategy. Leaders across Latin America studied the Mexican model, including Salvador Allende in Chile, Fidel Castro in Cuba, and Evo Morales in Bolivia. They admired how Mexico blended socialist principles with democratic institutions and avoided civil war after reform. Culturally, Mexico blossomed. Film studios grew rapidly in the 1930s, beginning the golden age of Mexican cinema. Actors, directors, musicians, and writers turned Mexican life into art. Rivera, Kahlo, Orozco, and Siqueiros produced murals that remain world treasures. History, once written by aristocrats, now belonged to people who tilled soil and worked factories. Cardenas's presidency symbolized rebirth, fulfilling forgotten promises of Villa, Zapata, and Madero. It was not perfect, but no revolution ever is. The revolution moved from violent rebellion to lasting institution. Mexico entered the mid-20th century stronger, prouder, and more united than before. The year 1940 marked a dramatic turning point in Mexican history. With Lázaro Cárdenas stepping down, Mexico transitioned from one of the most radical reformist periods to a more moderate, modernization-focused era under President Manuel Ávila Camacho. Though Mexico was no longer fighting in the trenches of revolution, the country continued evolving politically, culturally, and economically. The legacy of the Mexican Revolution remained a powerful force shaping identity and government legitimacy. Every new administration had to answer the question, how would they honor revolutionary promises while building a functioning industrial nation? Camacho brought a calmer political style than his predecessor. He represented a more centrist approach to governance and intentionally distanced himself from radical agrarian rhetoric. His slogan, "I am a believer," symbolized reconciliation between the state and the Catholic Church after the violent Cristero conflict. Rural communities welcomed the return of open worship, and although the state never reversed anti-clerical constitutional articles, enforcement became flexible. This shift helped stabilize national culture and reduce rural tensions. World War II changed Mexico's trajectory dramatically. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany's submarine campaign expanded into the Atlantic and Gulf waters. Two Mexican oil tankers, the Potrero del Llano and the Faja de Oro, were sunk by German U-boats. Public outrage pushed the government to declare war against the Axis powers in 1942. For the first time since independence, Mexico entered a global conflict as an international military ally. Mexico formed the Escuadron 201, a fighter squadron trained by the United States and deployed in the Pacific Theater. Though small in number, their involvement symbolized Mexico's arrival on the world stage. More significant than battlefield participation was the shift in political relations. Mexico and the United States, former rivals, became wartime partners. This partnership shaped migration, economics, and diplomacy for generations. The Bracero program emerged in this period. Starting in 1942, the United States invited Mexican laborers to work temporarily on American farms and railroads to address wartime labor shortages. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican men crossed the border to earn wages otherwise impossible in rural Mexico. The program reshaped border culture, influenced family histories, and connected Mexican workers to new economic environments. It also highlighted social exploitation, as many braceros faced discrimination, unpaid wages, and unsafe conditions. But despite injustice, the relationship built economic bonds that transformed both nations. Meanwhile, domestic industry expanded rapidly. The war reduced international competition and gave Mexico access to U.S. machinery and investment. Factories producing steel, textiles, cement, and automobiles multiplied. Cities like Monterrey and Mexico City exploded in population as rural migrants sought steady wages. The Mexican middle class, small and fragile before World War II, began to grow. But wartime prosperity and industrial expansion also exposed inequalities. Rural people often lacked access to new industries, leaving some regions underdeveloped. Traditional agriculture struggled to compete with industrial farming. Ejidos created during the Cardenas era needed more equipment than government credit could provide. As Mexico shifted economically toward manufacturing, political leaders faced pressure to update agrarian policy without abandoning revolutionary promises. Camacho's presidency also marked a cultural transformation. Public schools expanded further, literacy increased, and nationalist textbooks emphasized shared identity across ethnic divisions. The government promoted modern Mexican art, music, and cinema to build cultural unity. Film stars such as Dolores Del Rio, Maria Felix, and Pedro Infante shaped national imagination, turning Mexican cinema into a global powerhouse. Amid this cultural flowering, intellectuals explored new identities, blending rural traditions with modern urban life. When Camacho left office in 1946, he passed leadership to Miguel Alemán, the first civilian president since Madero. His election reflected Mexico's new phase, from revolutionary generals to university-educated civilian technocrats. Alemán promised modernization, industrialization, and international business integration, setting the stage for intense transformation that would reshape Mexico in the mid-20th century. Miguel Alemán Valdez symbolized a new political class in Mexico: urban, university-trained, modernist, and deeply committed to industrial capitalism rather than agrarian socialism. His presidency, 1946 to 1952, accelerated Mexico's transformation from a revolutionary state to a corporate nationalist republic centered around urban development. Alemán believed Mexico must modernize through infrastructure rather than communal redistribution. Highways, hotels, railroads, radio networks, and hydroelectric dams spread across the nation. Mexico City grew into a major Latin American metropolis, while coastal resorts like Acapulco became world famous. Economic optimism defined the era. Growth rates increased, investments multiplied, and foreign companies returned to Mexico after years of nationalist tension. Entrepreneurs and businessmen found favorable conditions for profit, but this prosperity had a price. Alemán's government prioritized wealthy industrial interests over rural ejidos. Land redistribution, once the emotional center of revolutionary identity, slowed dramatically. Many peasant communities felt abandoned. The government encouraged private agribusiness and irrigation farming in northern Mexico, which benefited wealthy landowners more than indigenous farmers. And this brings us to the end of our massive journey through the Mexican Revolution. Today, we explored one of the world's largest social and political transformations, a story that began with injustice, dictatorship, poverty, and fear, and ended with a nation forever changed. We learn how. Peasants rose up against landlords. Indigenous communities defended their identity. Workers fought for rights and dignity. Women redefined gender roles. The Constitution created equality and protection. Art, music, and culture transformed national identity, religion, education, and science reshaped the mind of Mexico. Democracy slowly grew from struggle and sacrifice, and how Zapata, Villa, and countless unnamed fighters gave their lives for justice. The moral of this history is powerful. Real change does not happen instantly. It happens across generations. The revolution teaches us that land matters, human rights matter, culture and identity matter. Freedom requires sacrifice. People can defeat injustice, and memory keeps nations alive. Even 100 years later, the revolution still shapes Mexico in politics, language, music, education, religion, feminism, migration, indigenous pride, and everyday identity. And that is why history matters, because it explains who we were, why we are here, and who we can become. Thank you for watching and listening to this long journey on this channel. If you enjoyed this story, if you love deep research, emotional storytelling, and historical truth, then stay with us. More stories are coming. More revolutions are waiting. More forgotten voices will rise again on this channel. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and return tomorrow, because the world is full of history that deserves to be told. Saying goodbye for now, but the past lives on. See you in the next story.